What about the situation of the non-status Aboriginal in Australia in the armed forces during World War II?
Okay. Aboriginal people are defined very differently in Australia than in Canada because there's no equivalent to the Indian Act. So before 1967, and actually also after 1967, in Australia, under the Australian Constitution, the power over Indigenous affairs was reserved to the states until 1967. And every state had an Aborigines Act. And every Aborigines Act kept being updated every few years. And they kept defining who was Aboriginal. So in some states, I think Queensland was one of the ones where if you had like 1/32nd, again, we don't use percentages normally in Australia now, that's very outdated, but then you were considered Aboriginal. There were other states that if you were, had only one grandparent who was Aboriginal, you weren't Aboriginal. But when it comes to the Second World War, in many ways this doesn't matter because the government just said, because they didn't actually record the race of people on enlistment. So in terms of trying to go back and find numbers, where it's been mostly happening is through going to families and through genealogy, and the Australian War Memorial has been doing quite a lot of that. The definition of Aboriginality was changed and set standardly federally in 1982. The current definition for an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person, you have to meet 3 requirements. 1, you do have to be of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. 2, you have to have a community with which you identify, and 3, that community has to identify you as a member. So there are controversies around that. We had an interesting court case a few years ago where a gentleman who may or may not be the equivalent of this Small who you mentioned, I will say a very right-wing commentator, published an op-ed where he was like really railing against these white Aborigines, as he called them, people who he didn't think were Aboriginal. You wouldn't necessarily know it looking at them, but he alleged were claiming it, this, that, the other. It was a court case, and he was essentially, I don't know if he was fined or what it was under the Racial Discrimination Act. So there is no status, but the definition is controversial because there are people who say, oh, if you don't look it, you aren't really, and I'm sure you probably have the same discussions here. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but we don't have status. You either are or you aren't. And for Aboriginal communities, there are the smaller the community and the more colonized they've been, the more controversial they tend to be of who is and who isn't. But generally speaking, Aboriginal communities, they say it doesn't matter how you look. It's you either are or you aren't. You're either one of us, you're connected to our kin, or you aren't. And also when you throw in the stolen generations, it's messed things up even more because there's all these people who, the stolen generations, they were removed as children, taken away, many raised not to know they were Aboriginal or raised to be ashamed of it, and then generations later people don't know, they're now discovering generations later they're Aboriginal. Some of those people deny it, some claim it. I'm sure there's similar stuff here as well, but the stolen generations has messed the whole thing up even more. And where the stolen generations make it even messier is because of the definition of you need a community to identify with and a community that identifies you. Now, the community can be an urban community. It could be, say, the Koori community in Melbourne. But you've got sort of new types of community forming as a result of the stolen generations having disrupted things so much, and people who just don't know where they're from.
I just wondered if I could get you to comment on what Canadians can take from an understanding of the Australian experience or vice versa, or I guess if I was going to phrase it another way is, why the hell are you on a panel named Contributions to the Canadian Armed Forces made by Indigenous Peoples?
I was wondering that myself. It's an excellent question, and strangely, I think you can always learn from each other, but I think actually Canada can learn more from Australia's post-war experience and vice versa, because hearing all this stuff about the Canadian Rangers and hearing the generals talk this morning, I was taking a lot that I thought, oh God, there should really be some ADF people here today. So I think a lot, I mean, the Second World War, I think as historians, we can always learn from the experiences, and as you well know, making the comparisons, learning, oh, that's interesting that you did that, we did this as well, here are some of the similarities. It teaches a lot about how colonialism played out, well, military as well, but colonialism played out in the different dimensions. It shows some of the commonalities of colonialism, but also its different manifestations in the different ways. So I think learning the history, I think, can do that. But especially also listening to the New Zealand paper earlier, I think Australia and Canada's contemporary experience with Indigenous people in the Defence Force have a lot more in common than we do with New Zealand. I really think that. I think the US is in a league of its own as well, but I don't know if that answers your question or not. But especially, I mean, similar issues of there is a remote part of the country with a larger but not exclusively Indigenous population that can be involved in that. There are serious problems of health, education, well-being in Indigenous communities, and the military can be a way to either work with communities or to provide skills. Both countries are doing that. Both countries have low participation rates and both want to raise them. Both have sets of programs. Like, I think there is a lot that they can learn in this contemporary environment. We can learn from New Zealand as well. I just think New Zealand's, again, different paradigm and starting at a different base.